Hello, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, exploring the recently released African Economic Outlook 2016. My name is Benjamin Simmons, and I serve as the head of the Green Growth Knowledge Platform Secretariat. Before we begin today's webinar, I would like to provide a few words of introduction. The GGKP is a global community of organizations and experts committed to collaboratively generating, managing, and sharing green growth knowledge and data. It was originally established a few years ago by the Global Green Growth Institute, the OECD, the United Nations Environment Program, and the World Bank, and is now a global partnership of nearly 50 leading international organizations, research institutes, and think tanks. We are delighted to be hosting today's webinar entitled The African Economic Outlook 2016, Sustainable Cities and Structural Transformation. It is indeed hard to imagine a topic of greater importance right now, given the massive migration to cities in Africa we are currently witnessing, and will likely continue to see until mid-century. Coupling this with the need to make unprecedented investments in infrastructure in these urban areas, and we can begin to get a sense of the challenges, but also significant opportunities for development, the environment, and improving livelihoods in Africa. These issues will be the focus of today's webinar discussions. Before introducing our first speaker for today's event, I'd like to highlight a few logistical issues. First, we strongly encourage participants to raise questions to the speakers throughout the webinar. This can be done by typing your question into the chat box, which can be found on the right-hand side of the webinar dashboard. Your questions will be submitted to our technical staff, who will then repost them to all the participants for our panelists to address during the question and answer period. We will also be circulating a survey after the webinar concludes, and I would encourage you to complete this as it provides us with important feedback to help shape our future webinars. Finally, if you have any technical issues with the webinar, please email us at contact@ggkp.org and we will help you troubleshoot. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our first speaker for today's event, Mr. Henri Bernard Solenac-Decompte. Henri Bernard is a senior economist and head of unit at the OECD, where he coordinates the OECD Development Center's work on Africa, including the African Economic Outlook. He has led numerous research projects on international trade, private sector development, and development finance. Before joining the center, Henri Bernard participated in the renegotiation of the ACP-EU trade agreements at the European Center for Development Policy Management and the Overseas Development Institute. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Paris at the Panthéon-Sorbonne. Henri Bernard, I am delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, and it's my great pleasure to turn the virtual podium over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be giving this presentation today. This is the highlights of a number of conclusions from the African Economic Outlook 2016. I'd just like to say that this report was very much a collective product. We couldn't have put it together without the help of our friends. First, the partners, the African Development Bank and UNDP, but of course a number of real experts of the topic, such as the African Centers for City and WWF. Thank you very much for having us. Just to give you a number of key facts and figures that we found, and hopefully some useful analysis, I'd like first to ask the question of what is special with Africa when it comes to the links between urbanization and structural transformation. The first thing, which is little known, is that Africa is experiencing both an urban and a rural boom. As you can see on this graph, we are right now in the process of reaching the year where about 50% of Africans will be urban dwellers. This is forecast to be taking place around 2037. But as you can see on this slide, it's also obvious that while the urban population is growing faster than the rural population, there is still a continuing rise in the number of people living in rural areas. And that is special because our economies in the OECD have more or less experienced the similar pattern of having emptying countrysides and cities growing at the same time. This is not happening in Africa. You have both a rapid growth of urban and rural populations. But the fact is that urbanization is a mega trend. There has been a tendency of governments in Africa in the past of trying to resist that trend for fear that urbanization would bring about a number of economic and political issues. But I think a key message is to say that this megatrend is happening, and it is very high time that governments in Africa start planning for the coming millions. A second important fact is that urbanization does not reduce poverty in and of itself. It is not the remedy for development. I heard, and maybe some of you have also in the recent years, people saying that poverty and development were going to be solved by the simple fact that very soon a majority of people would live in cities. This map here of Kenya is one illustration that this is not the case. We compare two different regions, Nakuru North and Nyando in the the west of Kenya, to show that while they both enjoy the same proximity to an urban center of more than 50,000 people, that's less than 2 hours away, despite this proximity, the effect of agglomeration is not a direct one on income levels. While Nakuru North enjoys a median income of about $1,077 in purchasing power parity, Nyando's median income is on average $259. So just an illustration that urbanization is not in itself the solution to development and poverty alleviation. It will work only if public policies support it. Another important fact about Africa is that in most countries, and we'll look at them in more details in a few minutes, in most countries in Africa, urbanization is not necessarily associated with industrialization. That again is a major difference with sort of the typical pattern of urbanization and industrialization going hand in hand, which again, most OECD countries at some point in their history have experienced, and most of Southeast Asian countries as well. This graph here compares the tendency for East Asia and Pacific countries and Sub-Saharan African countries over a period of several decades, so from 1966 for East Asia and Pacific and from 1976 for Sub-Saharan Africa. And it shows that as urbanization levels progress, so as we move to the right-hand side of the panel, in one case, you have a steadily high level of manufacturing as a share of the gross domestic product of East Asian economies, and a lower and declining share in the case of Africa. In other words, there's been a trend of deindustrialization in Africa as urbanization was progressing. So the two do not necessarily go hand in hand. Again, I will argue that public policies make the difference. Another interesting fact about the current trend of urbanization in Africa is that smaller cities, not the big megapolises, will drive and are driving urbanization. You can see here for different groups of countries that I will explain later, the contribution of rural areas in dark blue, small cities and small towns in gray, and big cities in light blue, to the overall growth of the population of those countries. And what you see is that in a number of countries, those that are natural resource-based, for instance, and those that are called the early urbanizers, small towns, small cities contribute more to the overall growth of population than megacities. It seems that in a number of cases, very big cities are gradually losing the power of attraction, and that what we could call rural towns seem posed to account for the greater wave of urbanization that's coming. So coming back to our topic, does urbanization in the case of Africa help structural transformation? To try and answer those questions, we had to account for the diversity of African countries. First, we went back to a definition of structural transformation that is simplified as having three components. You can understand structural transformation, which is the main objective of Agenda 2063 of the African Union, as first an economic process of factors of production being reallocated from low productivity activities to higher productivity activities. So that means labor and capital being divested from typically family farming to be invested into manufacturing or high-value added services. The second component of structural transformation is a demographic one. It is very simply the decline in fertility rates. As economies transform, people have fewer children. And the third dimension of structural transformation is the spatial dimension, and of course, it's urbanization. As economies transform, people tend to live more in cities and less in the countryside. So using these three different dimensions, we tried to come up with the typology of African countries to see where those three factors were happening at the same time. And there's merely 1 out of 5 groups where these three things happen concurrently. And that's a group of countries we call the diversifiers. You can see them here. It's Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, South Africa, Cape Verde, and Mauritius. What they have in common is that they are the most advanced on all three dimensions. First, economic diversification towards higher productivity activities. Second, declining fertility rates. And third, fairly high urbanization rates. On all of these accounts, they are far more advanced than any other country in Africa, which really sets them apart. And that's what you could call the diversifiers. They're the exception. If you look at the other categories, you have first what we call the early urbanizers. They have started their fertility transition. They have started urbanizing, but they are at an earlier stage. So you can see here a number of West African countries, Cameroon, Namibia, Djibouti. You have late urbanizers, mostly in East Africa. They also have started fertility transition. You can see that the number of children per woman is gradually declining, but they're not yet really advanced on the path to urbanization. And then finally, you have what we call the agrarian countries who have not really started their transition, demographic transition towards lower fertility rates and are very much behind the rest of the continent in terms of that urbanization levels. What all these three groups have in common is that there's very slow and sometimes no diversification towards more productive sectors. In other words, the economic dimension of structural transformation is really problematic, is lagging behind in this case of those countries. And then we have a last group, which we call the natural resource dependent countries, which are different. Some of them have started their fertility transition. Most have fairly high urbanization rates. It's the case in particular, the small oil exporting countries in Central Africa, who in the case of Gabon, for instance, or Brazzaville are way, Congo-Brazzaville, way above the 50, sometimes 60% of people now residing in cities. But they share with the previous three categories the fact that they have not really progressed on the diversification towards higher productivity activities. And in their case, it's partly because they remain very dependent on a limited number of unprocessed raw materials that they export. So, in other words, what you see is that you have, when you look at urbanization and structural transformation, you see very few African countries where both urbanization and economic diversification have been happening. You can see this on the right-hand side of the panel. You can see that very few of those lines are ticked in urbanization and economic diversification. The large majority of those African countries have still to put in place this virtuous circle. And the key conclusion here from a conceptual point of view is to stress that there is no straight causality relationship between those three dimensions. Fertility declining, urbanization, and diversification don't necessarily happen at the same time. They don't necessarily cause one another. And yet, urbanization in Africa comes with a number of costs. I will just stress two of them. There's far more in the report, of course, and I know that Kooky will be telling us about it in more details from the environmental point of view. First, the cost of air pollution. One of the contributions of our report was to come up with a new estimation of the economic cost of a number of risk factors, and in particular, looking at the cost of air pollution. It is here featured on this graph in two bars. The blue one is household air pollution. It is linked to the use of inefficient methods of cooking or heating. And the second one in green is ambient particulate matter pollution. This is largely related to pollution through traffic in cities in Africa. And what you can see here is that in spite of the fact that industrialization is progressing only very slowly and sometimes regressing on the continent, in spite of that, air pollution is already a very important concern of public health. So in other words, you have a lot of the costs of economic agglomeration through ambient particulate matter pollution without having the benefits of more concentration as you can see in this new graph. This is to illustrate the fact that a lot of Africa's growth of cities happens through sprawling. In other words, you have people tend to flock around established perimeters of cities and to build their own houses, which are not several storage buildings, but are usually 1 or 2 level installments, and that creates the sprawling effect. It means that as populations flock around those big cities, they tend to settle further and further away from the center, and as a result, further and further away from where jobs are. A lot of the benefits of urbanization in the experience of OECD and Asian countries has been in making jobs more accessible to people. But in this case, as you can see here, with the expansion of the footprint of Accra, these benefits hardly materialize, because if you live on the outskirts of a city that spreads very, very far out from the center, then getting to jobs by foot is going to be extremely difficult, and using transportation means in congested cities also proves difficult. As a result, what our results show is that most people have a difficulty accessing the majority of jobs, in spite of having moved to cities. There are some benefits, but our point is that they materialize only if the right policies come with them. The first benefit is, of course, the connection with the rural areas. It's very important when we talk about urbanization in Africa to stress that cities are not islands. They are the hub of the economic fabric of a nation, of a region, and as such, they must be looked at also as an extremely powerful vehicle for growth in rural areas. What you see here is the correlation between the average travel time to the nearest large city from rural areas and total crop production. And the result is very clear. The closer you live to a large city, the closer you live to an urban market, the higher the total crop production. This is also illustrated here in this map that we took from our colleagues from the Sahel and West Africa Club, which shows the imprint of big cities in West Africa in rural areas. Of course, a key argument in favor of urbanization is that cities can provide enabling conditions to host more productive sectors. And you can see here the sort of virtuous circle that you typically want to have in successful urban areas between higher productivity, attraction of capital, firms, and skilled workers, and agglomeration effects with the pooling of labor, the pooling of inputs, the better access for services, for economic activities, to knowledge, spillovers, university, what have you. But again, this happens only if those infrastructure are in place that will make access easy, and if those service providers are present in those cities. They don't happen in and of themselves, and in many cities we've looked at, this is not happening. Of course, cities can also be hubs in the networks for fostering greater regional integration. You have here a map that we borrowed from our African Development Bank colleagues. This is the plan for trans-African highways that would connect major cities throughout the continent and favor greater regional integration by increasing regional trade, including, as you can see, between the West Coast, Sahelian countries, and North African countries. But this is only a plan, and for the moment, a key obstacle to growing those networks is, of course, leveraging the necessary finance to build this infrastructure and reducing the other barriers, non-infrastructure related to trade and exchanges amongst African countries. This is just an illustration that I will only mention briefly, that providing access to electricity is more cost-effective in big cities. This is borrowed from the International Energy Agency report on Sub-Saharan Africa, and the foreseen increase in the demand for electricity will, of course, be all the more important in urban areas as the growth of cities progress, and so potentially it would be more profitable for energy providers to provide energy to Africans once they become urbans. Of course, all these benefits and tackling these challenges will only work if the adequate policies are in place, and UN reports have been documenting the fact that it is unfortunately not the case in many countries. You have in many cases some patterns of urbanization that see no real planning for people moving into cities, no real planning for natural growth of urban populations, and as a result, our friends from the Center for African Cities will say that the typical pattern is one of slum urbanization. To try and remedy this, the report calls for the adoption of new, ambitious national urban strategies. They will be country-specific, so there's no one-size-fits-all, of course. Cabo Verde, Nigeria, and South Africa have very different challenges and very different cities to work from, but we believe that a number of principles are in order everywhere. The first one is to have strategies that are participatory and work with communities, including urban communities who have already been forced in many cases to provide to themselves their own services in the absence of adequate supply by central governments. They need to be multi-sectoral because too often the silo effect of working in sectors prevents effective implementation of our urban planning. And they have to be place-based because, again, too much emphasis on national-wide statistics, too much emphasis on sectoral plans of action tends to bypass the necessity of looking at this multi-sectoral aspect of things in the place-based context. Some policy priorities, which we believe are shared by all countries, are the absolute necessity to progress with urban land reform. Of course, delivering the necessary infrastructure, not just within cities, but connecting them to rural areas, and differentiating between the roles of various cities of different sizes. We believe, and we stress in particular, the fact that intermediary cities have a very important role to play, whereas too often capital cities tend to concentrate most of the resources. Finally, all this can happen only if decentralization is made effective. This can only be possible if the necessary capacity exists at subnational levels of governance, and very often the gap in capacity is even more daunting at municipal and local level than it is at central level, and it needs to be accompanied by a number of guarantees in terms of transparency in order to avoid corruption that is often associated with decentralization matters. These are very generic conclusions. I will leave it here for the discussion and hope to have triggered an interesting debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henri Bernard. This is an extremely interesting presentation, an excellent overview of the mega trends we see shaping the African urban landscape and some of the challenges and opportunities associated with these trends. What I found particularly interesting is the general lack of economic diversification across most of the African countries, and that it appears to be smaller cities that are the drivers of urbanization rather than the mega cities one sees in so many other regions of the world. It is now my great pleasure to introduce the second speaker for today's webinar, Kooky Gobber, who is the WWF International Global Lead for Green Economy. In this role, she is responsible for leading the development, alignment, and implementation of the WWF Network Green Economy Strategic Plan. She provides policy advice, advocacy, and capacity support for the WWF network, as well as building and maintaining external partnerships on the green economy agenda, including with the Green Growth Knowledge Platform. Before joining WWF, Kooky worked as a management consultant, focusing on sustainable finance and corporate responsibility, and most recently she led and coordinated the launch and roadmap development for the Natural Capital Declaration. Importantly for today's event, Kooky was actively engaged and contributed her expertise to the development of the African Economic Outlook. She holds a master's in international economics from the University of Maastricht, an MBA in strategic carbon management and climate change from the University of East Anglia, and a diploma in management consultancy from the Institute of Consultancy and Chartered Management Institute in the UK. I should mention that Kooky only has audio connection rather than video today, so although we will not be able to see Kooky, we will be able to hear her insights. Kooky, it is a great pleasure to have you join the webinar. The podium is yours.
Ben, thank you so much for your very generous introductions. Hello, everyone. I would like to thank GGKP for hosting this webinar and organizing it in such an effective, efficient way. So it's really a great pleasure to be here. And I'm very much delighted to say that WWF has participated and contributed to this Africa Economic Outlook. It's been great working with our collaboration with the OECD Development Center and others. And this is actually the first contribution of WWF for the Africa Economic Outlook. And we're really excited to work on this very topical agenda on sustainable cities and their transformation for sustainable economies. So very briefly, to present my outline of today, I will just quickly talk about and highlight a few of the findings that we thought were quite important in terms of what the report produced, and then we'll discuss some of the opportunities and available for African cities, and draw some conclusions around what needs to happen and next steps. So this is really going to be kind of a very, very high level highlight, and I'm hoping that you'll take some time to read the report, and hopefully that we continue to engage as we move forward. So one of the things that we thought that was quite important that needed that was a part of the finding was that we need to have a better spatial planning, and that urban strategy, where there is available, needs to be linked with the national development plan. A lot of the times these two go have gone separately, so that you have development plans for infrastructure and others that actually do not link to the place-based spatial realities on the ground, and this of course causes a lot of environmental risks, such as water scarcity, planning and urban sprawl, and the wrong places where you have wetlands and water catchment areas for the cities themselves, whether it's upstream or downstream, and also overexploitation of resources, natural resources, or degradation of land also causes a lot of negative impact in terms of the economic activities. At the same time, also has an impact on the rural communities in terms of the availability of resources, but also in the urban areas where you do have issues with availability of clean drinking water, sanitation, etc. In the urban areas. Another point maybe to highlight is that urban wood fuel is one of the key causes of deforestation in Africa and land degradation, and footprint of cities in terms of deforestation really goes way beyond the city perimeters, and this is some of the key issues that we need to address in terms of actually impact on our natural resources in the wider spatial plan. Just to give you maybe an example, this is a map that we produced for Kenya for one of their planned transport infrastructure corridors. It's called the LAPSET, and you could see, I don't know if it's very visible, but you could see, for instance, the pink lines that go through the protected areas, which are basically opening the corridor for a movement of trucks or people into the protected areas, and this is obviously without really having an idea of an assessment of what the implications would be for the habitat there, in terms of actually also the impact on tourism, etc. So in terms of actually having the national development plan linking to the urban strategy and what this means with coordinating it and actually making sure that it's coherent, this kind of it shows clearly on what's happening when you're not really looking at the bigger picture. And then also in this map we have actually identified, and I'm not going to go too much into it, actually the World Heritage sites, the Ramsar sites, and also including the likelihood of urbanization by 2030. So you can see it goes from 0 to 100, and the red ones are basically the 100% likelihood of urbanization. So you can see that this urban sprawl is happening. Another example here is three cities. We took example from Lusaka, Dar es Salaam, and in Tunisia. And here we mapped the wetlands in Africa, the Ramsar sites, so which are the wetlands of international importance. And we also mapped the watershed areas for these cities. So the blue highlighted area is basically the watershed which provides water supply for the respective cities. And you can see, for instance, if you take Harare, for example, you can see that the urban, there's the current urban and the anticipated urban area is basically expanding on the watershed. This means that there's a future or even present high risk of water scarcity and water risk. Both have a huge economic impact in terms of availability of water for economic activity or for the urban population as a whole. The same thing you can see an example of Lusaka and also for Tunisia as well. So you can see the urban sprawl within the watershed areas. So this all kind of highlights the fact that if we're not going to have an idea of how we're going to urbanize, where we're going to urbanize, and how this links with the rural areas, and in fact, if you look at it from the Africa perspective also, where as you can see, the watershed area goes across countries, and how this impacts also the inter-regional or inter-country implications. If we don't look at the big picture, then we actually are sitting on a big risk going forward. So in terms of what this means is that we need to recognize that the environment is an important element in actually maintaining and fast-tracking economic development in Africa, and that there isn't any dichotomy between managing our natural resources sustainably and reducing poverty and increasing economic development. So that we need to recognize that, as Henry said, that we shouldn't just have the cost of urbanization or the cost of development, but we need to make sure that we also have the benefit. And therefore, one of the key things is to recognize the importance of nature in economic activities. This could include some of the ecosystem benefits in terms of regulating climate, etc. The ecosystem services that provides actually for the urban population, being the informal ones or the formal. And actually, in order to be able to do that, we need to recognize the value of it. In Africa, there's very little data and information on actually what the value of ecosystem services are. There was some estimation I've mentioned here on my slide. Between Asia and Africa, the difference is 70 billion versus 5.25 billion. And this doesn't mean that this is the only benefit. Actually, this means that we need to actually have more information about it in order to be able to understand what the benefits are and how we can manage it in the future as well. And other benefits of nature, which are actually green infrastructure, is around mangroves and coastal cities and coastal areas, which protect cities and urban dwellings from sea level rise and so on. And recognizing that the climate change is going to have massive impact for Africa. This is quite an important service that nature provides, which needs to be recognized as part of the mitigation and adaptation strategy for Africa, but also recognizing that this plays an important economic value for cities which are based in coastal areas. And just looking at kind of maybe which cities are in coastal areas, half of the 10 fastest growing economies have major economic hubs and cities on the coast. So Cote d'Ivoire, Mozambique, Tanzania, Sierra Leone, and Kenya are to name a few, who actually contribute hugely to the overall economic growth for each country. And so therefore it's quite important for us to recognize the value of nature for economic dynamism. This is just the same example. We've mapped basically some coastal areas and looked at their urban sprawl and anticipated urban sprawl and projected sea level rise. And you could see basically there's a confluence of that, and that's a massive risk for investment, for economic development, and obviously for the huge amount of people living in these urban areas. So if we are not looking at how we're going to manage this in the today and in the future, and how we link it to our development plan and industrialization policy, then we are sitting on a big risk for the future. Having said that, and having highlighted maybe quickly some of the risks that we find in Africa, there are also opportunities. Firstly, Africa and countries still have a very low ecological footprint relative to other parts of the world, and therefore this is a window of opportunity to keep the metabolic rate of African cities low, but at the same time increase economic development and poverty reduction. So there is an opportunity to actually benefit from this ecological low footprint at the moment. And this also benefits because as the infrastructure and develops for Africa, instead of locking ourselves in a high carbon economy, we could actually leapfrog towards a low carbon economy. And as we speak now, the technology in terms of renewables and others is accelerating very fast. So there's an opportunity to actually make our cities work for a sustainable economy of the future. And the other opportunities, of course, is as cities are emerging, not just the mega cities, but secondary cities or third level cities. These could be areas of positive investment opportunities for investors in terms of investing in sustainable infrastructure, in terms of investing in renewable energy, and the like, and actually basing the economy in the future as opposed to be in the past. So I think this is one area that is beneficial. Another area is in terms of actually looking at linking the urban and the rural through financial mechanisms for payment for existing services, which could actually benefit the rural communities in managing and maintaining their natural capital that cities are very much dependent on in terms of availability of clean drinking water and so on, and including industries actually for production services. So there are many opportunities that cities could benefit by looking at how they can attract innovative finance for nature. So what are some of the conclusions that we think are important and need to be addressed? First of all, we need to connect cities in the right way. As we saw, some of the infrastructure corridors, some of the development plans are not necessarily linking on the ground to what actually is happening in terms of the environment and ecological landscape. So we need to make sure that the infrastructure we build, the development plan that we have in place actually is not going to undermine economic development in the long term, but actually it will go hand in hand in benefiting and managing this at the same time, so it actually is going to be sustainable in the future and in the long term. So this is quite an important point. The other thing is that actually we need to be able to understand and value ecosystem services, and both obviously in economic terms, but also in other benefits for people. But this is an important point to make, because it's important to for first and foremost to recognize the importance of it and to be able to understand how it benefits cities and urban areas, and then to be able to actually link it with urban strategies and city planning, and at the same time also with the national development plans. So again, maybe to reiterate Henry Bernard's points around that it has to be place-based, and it has to have actually a spatial element of it in order to be able to understand how we can have public policy for formulation that will actually benefit cities. And the third point is that we need to kind of have a landscape approach, that recognizing that cities are not separate entities, but they are part of a wider mosaic. This could be at the regional level, this could be also at even at the Africa level, but even within countries, that we need to recognize the impact of the supply upstream and downstream as well, and that's why it's important to also see the value of spatial planning in here. So in terms of next steps, what needs to happen? One of our findings was that at the city level or sub-regional level, there's very, very limited data on environment, and I think this is important if we are able to look into manage natural resources better. That we need to have the right sort of information and data, and I think this, as a next step, would be an important element to take this forward from governments. And I'm not sure, for instance, whether the SDGs, for instance, will also address data and information at the city or sub-regional level, but this is important for us to be able to address these issues if we're going to be successful. So we need to integrate environmental indicators at the national economic development plans, but that also takes data from cities. And then the second point is that in order to manage what we better, we need to also have an idea of what we have and what the costs and benefits are. And this hasn't really happened at continent-wide in Africa, and I think we need to be able to do that and understand what the cost-benefit analysis are for ecosystem services, for watersheds, for coastal areas, for mangroves, and marine resources. So we need to be able to have that information, have that knowledge to be able to actually make wise decisions on policies and recommendations. So this would be something that we think needs to happen next. And the third point is that we need to link climate policies, development plans, and urban strategies kind of in a more coherent way in order to help us leapfrog and actually move forward with a low carbon economy. This could be provided also through renewables and off-grid electricity for informal settlements. In the report, we took 24 countries and we used a tool that we've developed with our Norwegian office called ReCalc, which basically reallocated fossil fuel subsidies at the national level to invest in renewables for these cities. You can find more detail in the report. But what we found is between 2017 and 2025, if we actually reallocate the fossil fuel subsidies today, we will, on current consumption, we will be able to provide 55 million people more access to electricity. We reduce the greenhouse gas emission, save 20 million liters of water, etc. So the point is that it can be done if we have the right policies and the right incentives. Which brings me to my last point, which is basically Africa does not have the opportunity to say we're going to pollute now and clean up later, as many other countries have done perhaps in the previous times. We can see that from the air pollution and from the other points that Henry Roland mentioned and some of the points that I've highlighted that we are already seeing the cost of urbanization without really seeing necessarily the benefit. And the same thing is happening from the environmental and ecological perspective. But at the same time, there is an opportunity for us, for Africa, to be able to say, actually, we could be an example of, having livable cities in Africa and having economic development that is actually in line and in sync with well-managed natural resources and natural and ecosystem services and so on. So what we really need here is the political will and the long-term thinking to recognize that we need to do this in a more systematic and clearly planned and designed way. Obviously, we need the capacity to do that. But ultimately, we need the political will to deliver and to also enable cities and towns and urban areas also to have the room to be able to think and participate in the development plan for Africa. I'll leave it here. Thanks.
Thanks, Kooky. That was a fascinating overview of the challenges urbanization poses for the populace, but also, importantly, the surrounding ecosystems. I also found your recommendations and call to action on how Africa can develop sustainable cities and ultimately lead the world in this regard was particularly compelling. Thank you. Now, to jumpstart a wider discussion on these presentations, we are fortunate to have Anton Cartwright, join us as a discussant for today's webinar. Anton is a green economy researcher at the African Center for Cities, where, among other things, he is engaged in the development of Cape Town's green economy. He's also a senior associate at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership and an associate of the Stockholm Environment Institute, where he's an editor of the Economics of Climate Adaptation section of the We Adapt knowledge portal. In addition to these activities, he continues to run the development economics consultancy Econologic that he founded in 2003, and he is the founding director of the not-for-profit organization Promoting Access to Carbon Equity and South Africa's first voluntary carbon market registry, Credible Carbon, which has raised over 7 million South African rand for carbon mitigation projects in South Africa's rural and informal communities. Anton, despite your obviously heavy workload, we are delighted you could join us today as a discussant and look forward to your reflections. After Anton's remarks, I will turn it back to the speakers to see if they have any reflections on the comments, and then open it up to the questions that we have been receiving from participants. So if you haven't yet sent in your questions, please do so now. Anton, the podium is yours.
Benjamin, thank you very much. And thank you to both Kooky and to Henry Bernard for what I thought were two fantastic presentations. It's a great privilege to be able to respond to those, and also a little daunting. And I suppose I should say that those two presentations reflect what I thought was a remarkable African Economic Outlook report. We were obviously a contributor to that report, but only in a very small way, and we certainly feel that we were more beneficiaries and contributors. And so the broader point is, I think, an important one for those of us who work on making African cities more legible and for preparing the world and perhaps the global economy for a world in which 1 in 4 urban people are African. This report is a rich resource, and it's certainly one that we'll be able to use time and time again. And of course, it's also very timely coming ahead, and that's not a coincidence, but it's very useful coming ahead of Quito Habitat 3 in a few months' time. So there's so much that I could respond to and want to, but I'll try and honor time. I think one of the things that the presentations and indeed the report itself do particularly well is speak to the long-standing bias, and it's the development bias on the African continent, which historically has been rural, and focus attention on obviously the rapid urbanization trend and the implications of that, but also to couch African cities and these emerging African cities as an economic opportunity. And that's a new narrative. That's a challenging political narrative, as I think Henry Bernard said in his introduction, but it's an important narrative. But then in the same breath, what the report does excellently, and Henry Bernard picked up on this, is to take away the threat of this being somehow a threat to rural development, and to highlight the linkages. And that's unusual. Certainly in the literature and in the political discourse, to point out to rural constituents that urban development could be a positive thing for them, and that there isn't this standoff or this bifurcation. And the more we can emphasize those linkages, the better. At the same time, I do think we need to address the long-standing structural bias towards rural development, which, frankly, given the demographic shift, is increasingly inappropriate. And then, of course, the report is excellent in highlighting that whilst elsewhere in the world urbanization has been highly correlated with certainly per capita income growth and very often broader development as well, that this isn't the case on the African continent. And in fact, what we see in Africa is rapidly growing cities without what we call in the urbanization dividend, without some of the benefits which come, and of course very important for practitioners. The agglomeration effects that have driven economic growth and structural transitions elsewhere during urbanization phases elsewhere in the world don't seem to manifest as acutely anyway on the African continent. You can look to labor market dynamics and educational attainment, but ultimately I think what it comes down to is that the great advantage of urbanization presented elsewhere of lower service delivery costs isn't being capitalized on sufficiently in Africa. If we are going to absorb the, whatever it is, 22, 23 million that is people that is added to African cities every year and will be continue to be added for the next 3 decades, if you're going to absorb and assimilate those people in healthy and productive livelihoods and in functional cities, a big part of that comes down to infrastructure and basic services. Understanding why that is not the case is important, because that leads you to the default, which is what people have alluded to already, which is some urbanism or informality. And I think there are 2 parts to that story. One is, and I think the first step is to recognize that informality, what we call the urban reality of most Africans. Okay? So we need to understand it better. And we need to get behind this sort of otherness of informality as if it's something which we can ignore, because it's not. It's the majority city, and we need to understand both the conditions which predispose informality, and then also understand how people construct their lives under conditions that we call informality, but which, as I say, is the lived reality. And once we've done that, then I think we do need to have a very honest conversation around how we deliver services in these cities. And I'm delighted that the report itself and the presentation so far refer to the importance of multi-level governance. We cannot overemphasize the need for local decision-making and for local budget allocations, but the reality is that in many African cities, the capacity to do that right now is very limited. And in fact, in many ways, the secondary cities in particular, but even some of the capitals on the continent, challenge the very definition of a city, in that they don't have a democratically elected authority, they don't have clear geographical boundaries, and they don't have self-identifying citizens necessarily. They have transient communities. And so I think this has implications for the policy prescripts and the policy instruments that we use. Because some of the highly normative recommendations, including recommendations on structural transitions of the economy, struggle to gain traction in this context. Yeah? And so whilst on the one hand we must remain committed to decentralizing decision-making, and that must happen, and we must, as part of that, we must commit to devolving budgets. At the same time, we cannot play to what is quite a weak hand on the continent, which is, in some instances, local governments and local authorities. And so we need to imagine, as part of this process of decentralization, as a way of delivering services, we need to imagine hybrids of governance that I think necessarily include national government in partnership with local governments and sometimes with traditional authorities, to be effective in managing land, which is important for the sprawl issue, which has already been referenced, and to be effective in providing services. And I think if we're honest, we don't know exactly what those hybrids look like, and they're certainly not going to be easy. There's deep antagonism between national and local governments, and there are resource issues, and these need to be addressed. But I think multi-level governance has to be prioritized as an institutional challenge if we are going to consider providing services. And of course, apart from the public policy issues and the governance issues around infrastructure and services, they're also very acute fiscal issues. It's simply not the case that you can take the traditional model of infrastructure finance based on user pays and build the type of sanitation systems, water treatment plants, centralized energy plants that have served cities elsewhere in the world extremely well, because you don't have the affordability. And so I think there are clues as to how you get around this in, again, what people and communities are doing in the absence of formal government. So the off-grid energy revolution in East Africa, for example, some of the sanitation solutions and the transport solutions that are emerging because of need, but somewhat in the vacuum left behind by formal government, I think provide tools, provide clues and insights into how it needs to be done. And of course, this will be very different to the way in which we've built and serviced cities in the past, and I think that's part of the challenge. And then a final point to pick up on Kooky's presentation, which I really enjoyed. And I didn't know that this was the first time that WWF has been invited to contribute to the African Economic Outlook, but I'm delighted that they were, because I think it's essential. Because I think one of the ways around the affordability challenge is to look at the municipal services, so very basic services, water purification, energy, recreation, flood buffering, that is already provided by the natural environment, and to be sure in the first instance that when we provide municipal services using infrastructure, that we don't destroy what we've got already, because that would be foolish. And then to recognize that very often working with what I guess we could call ecological infrastructure and ecosystem goods and services, and enhancing those and restoring those, you can sometimes provide a better service, a better urban service at a lower cost, and very often providing more employment, and certainly providing more appropriate employment and more place-based employment, and is the case with conventional infrastructure and services. And so, I thought Kooky's presentation and her contribution to the report is extremely well made. One word of caution on that is that I personally, and this is based on our own experience, I think that the pricing of and the valuing of that natural capital is important, necessary, but insufficient. And so I think you have to go beyond that and actually re-rate, possibly at the global level, re-rate natural capital to make sure that it becomes part of local and then regional and global economies. And of course, a carbon price would do that. A different approach to soil carbon, which recognize the value of carbon left in the soil, especially in rural communities, would do that. And there are similar, I think, interventions which probably need to be sparked at the global level that could be implemented around waste and around extractive economies. Because pricing on its own, certainly in our experience, is insufficient to ensure that that natural capital is validated and is protected in the way that I think it needs to be. And of course, linked to that is this point around leapfrogging, which Kooky made very well, I thought, and the report speaks to that well. And of course, it's a compelling concept. And Africa needs to leapfrog. That's its best advantage of securing a measure of competitive advantage that it's lacked in the global economy up until now, is to try and learn from the mistakes and get ahead in the low carbon economy. But let's not imagine that that's easy. And it's certainly not only a technological challenge. It has to go hand in glove with what Henry Bernard, I think, referred to as public policy development, and certainly institutional development as well. So leapfrogging is compelling and I think necessary, but a lot more work needs to be done on how to make it effective at the same time. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Anton. You raise a number of very interesting points, certainly about the political economy challenges, both in terms of public policy development and overall economic development, and that in fact Africa might be seen as somewhat different than some of the other regions where we've seen similar migrations to urban areas. Let me now turn it back quickly to our speakers to see if they have any reflections on the points you raise. Henry Bernard, let me begin with you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Anton, for your kind words and your comments. We certainly appreciated working with you and your expertise. On the rural bias, I think I'm quite surprised, I must say, that this is not a problem of the past. This is not just about past policies having been affected by this rural bias. There is still a strong reluctance, I hear, in the discourse today, in the many meetings I've been attending, strong reluctance towards especially migration from rural areas. And when we speak to municipal leaders, national leaders in West Africa and other regions, a lot of them are complaining about the ills that rural migration causes to their cities. And I think I'm not sure whether rural bias captures the whole concern, but it's really about thinking that if you develop the supply of services, the infrastructure of the city, then you will tempt more people to come. And so by not investing in infrastructure, by not delivering those services, you hope that that will keep them away. And if there's one thing that we've learned over the last few decades is that it doesn't work. People will come. And if they don't find the services, they will create their own service supplies mechanism. If they don't find the infrastructure, they will build their own infrastructure, informal and badly conceived as it may be. So I think we still have an uphill battle here to try and convince policymakers at local and central level that urbanization is happening and planning for it is absolutely necessary. There are a number of examples that we try to put together in the report on cities like Addis Ababa who are trying to plan for those coming urbanites. It doesn't go without difficulties. So you heard about the tragic events that happened in the last few months around the urban expansion plan of Addis Ababa and the resistance of some of the communities. But I think that the fact that these cities will have to host a growing number of people needs to be planned for. An essential related aspect is the rural-urban divide. One thing that the report is trying to make clear is that the border between rural and urban is getting more and more blurry, and it makes little sense to continue to distinguish between the two. To be honest, if you look at the way providers of official development assistance in rich countries are organized, they tend to reinforce that bias because very often you go and speak to them about territorial development and they look at you and asking themselves, is that my urban policy planning team or is it the rural development team? And if it doesn't fit in either, then it probably doesn't fit anywhere. So there's still another uphill battle in trying to get people to think of space, to think of territories, to think of place-based approaches that connects the urban and the rural instead of considering them as two silos. And then a final word on natural capital. Taking account of natural capital, I think this is a general issue that we've been discussing with WWF. We really hope that they will help us in the future make our report, which still focuses on the traditional indicators of GDP and GDP per capita, a bit more inclusive in terms of valuing natural capital. So a third uphill battle that I'd like to stress in response to your very useful comments.
Thank you, Henri. Kooky, any comments from your side? I believe there was a comment directly focused on the sufficiency of natural capital valuation. I was wondering if you'd like to respond to that and other thoughts provided by Anton.
Yeah, sure. Maybe let me just start with, and Anton, thank you very much for your fantastic presentation and reflections. In terms of the rural-urban divide, I think one thing that really connects urban and rural is nature and environment, because cities are dependent on not just from their vicinity, but really beyond their area. So in terms of actually what the services they receive, it's very much in the rural area. So if we can, that's one way of actually connecting them is through linking those the rural and urban area through the ecosystem service and the valuation of that and recognizing it. And I think I recognize that pricing it is not sufficient. I was really talking about more the valuation of it. And in fact, through our natural capital project, which we work with Stanford University and others, and Nature Conservancy, we've been looking at actually the health benefits of natural capital and actually how that actually is benefiting people as well. So there's much more work in this area that goes behind the pricing it, but really recognizing the value of it itself. And maybe to give an example of concrete green infrastructure benefits, I mean, we know the story of the city of New York and others who've actually invested on green infrastructure that because it's much more better to manage their the forests that provide the purification for their water supply rather than actually having a chemical cleaning facility, because that was much more cheaper and more sustainable. And likewise, I think it was an example of Kampala where actually people started building houses in the wetlands that provided water supply to Kampala. And what happened was actually this was unplanned, so people just went and basically actually literally start building houses. And they recognized that they had to then clean the water. What they were doing, they were spending more than $2 million a year doing that. And I mean, recognizing that this was unsustainable for them, actually what they've now tried to do is restore the wetland and move the people away. So in terms of actually what's important is that we need to think about long-term and plan and recognize where the links are, and if we're going to have an urbanization, what does it mean in terms of actually the resources required to manage these people, not just the infrastructure or housing, but actually the basically the elements in the background that will help them sustain it. And what does it mean in terms of the rural areas who ultimately will need to manage, or you need to manage the the law of the land and things like that. So I think this is quite an important one. My key issue would be that we need to link it to the development plan. We need to link it to the national plan, the SDGs, and so on. That there is a kind of a direct link about what the government, which industries that they're going to develop, and how they're going to generate their income and their economic development and jobs. What does it mean on the ground, actually, from the ecological perspective or from the spatial perspective as well? So having that kind of this landscape approach will also stop the the kind of the silo approach with different sectors, because, for instance, agriculture versus mining versus industry, they all depend on the same resources, one way or another. So how do we make sure that all of that also fits in with the urban strategy? So I think I'll leave it here. There's some questions on the chat. I don't know if you want us to answer that, or do you will you read them out first? So.
Yes, I'll provide the questions to you. Thank you, Kooky. So that was a good segue, Kooky, because now we'd like to turn to the questions we are receiving from the participants. Before we do, we did circulate a question during the registration period as well. And the question was to the participants, what do you see as the biggest challenge for African urbanization? And it was interesting to note around 90 participants responded to the question. And the top 3 issues mentioned were urban planning, governance, and infrastructure. All obviously key issues that have been discussed by the speakers and the discussant, Antoine. So I think that resonates well right now with the audience in terms of the presentations we've received. We've received several questions from the audience. Some, I think, they're going to be quite challenging questions. So what I'll do is I'll pose 3 of the questions and then turn it back to the panel for your response. We have about 25 minutes now for this question and answer session. So the first question was from Robert Mwaniki, and his question is, how do we address the issue of rural-urban migration leading to formation of informal settlement areas called slums? I think this was touched on a bit earlier by Henri Bernard. We have a second question from Hyung Tai Kim. What are the determinants which make some natural resources abundant countries develop while some countries with similar conditions are struggling? So we have natural resource abundant countries that are developing while other countries with very similar conditions, similar natural resources, are struggling. Then the third question is from Gao Jingjing. What are the main gaps between the green growth theories and the practice, especially in the developing countries, and what could we do to address those gaps? So now let me turn it over to the panel for their reflections. So let me start this time with Kooky. Any thoughts from your side?
Oh, those are very difficult questions. I guess maybe to start with the last one around green growth theories and the gap on the ground. I guess from reflection around, focused on the urban cities in Africa, is that okay. So if you look at, let's say, the UK Brexit at the moment, and maybe just to mention the role of cities, the City of London having such a significant role in the economy and the generation of income and employment, etc., is really pushing to have a seat on the table with the national government to actually talk about how they're going to deal with the Brexit issue. Now, compare this to, let's say, cities in Africa and how cities and urban areas are being perceived, or at least how even, as emerging secondary cities, what their role is in terms of actually deciding sort of the kind of policies, the capacity that they have, the infrastructure that they have, in order to be able to actually have a conversation about what the future looks like. So in terms of governance and what's happening in the green growth, let's say, theories, is that I think we're not bringing up and actually giving them more political currency for cities and urban areas to be able to be part of that conversation and participate in how they generate future economic activities, and how that would fit in, and what's the best way to do it at the kind of place-based, at the spatial level. So I think it's important to create that balance and to bring those governance issues to the fore. And I'm hoping that maybe at the Habitat 3, some of these issues will be raised, and they'll be looking for solutions around that. And so I think that's an important point to make, and that also will have obviously huge implications for the environment, for the climate policy, and so on. Maybe the others could pick the other points.
Sure. Henri Bernard, let me turn to you. Would you like to take a stab at any of the questions posed?
Sure. Let me get back to Robert's question regarding rural-urban migration. I'd say three things. The first one is that let's not forget that most of the urban growth is actually natural growth. It's city dwellers having lots of babies. For the cities for which we were able to collect data, it seems that rural-urban migration accounts for something between 25–30% of the growth in urban population, so not the largest part. So it is to be kept in mind. The second thing is that the best way of tackling this issue is to plan ahead. So again, I'm getting back to a point I made earlier. It may sound trivial, but it is surprising how in many cities these structures for planning ahead the expansion and the arrival of newborn babies in cities and rural migrants are simply not there. One key obstacle, of course, is the lack of data. Data at national level is already hard to come by, and everybody will tell you that subnational statistical systems are even more in a poor shape. But we can't wait to have perfect data before we plan and before we act. There's a number of ways of making for these data gaps. One is to use satellite imagery, for instance, to complement demographic surveys. There's a very good example of that happening. I invite you to have a look at Africa Police. If you Google it, you'll find it very easily. It's hosted by the Sahel and West Africa Club. It combines the demographic surveys with aerial and satellite imagery to give a very precise account of the expansion of urban areas throughout West Africa. And the good news, by the way, is that with some funds for USA, they are currently expanding the whole Africa Police database to the entire African continent. There's other ways also of collecting data is to collect it from the field itself, from the local communities. And we have tried to document a number of participatory scenario building exercises that involve local communities that withhold a lot of the very useful information that planners would need. So again, there are ways of circumventing the problem of data, and planning is certainly the first best. There's also the issue of trying to improve slums once they exist. There are some examples of countries having done it with more or less success. So towards the more successful experiences that we have reviewed, there's the case of a number of Moroccan cities in particular. But my understanding, and Anton will confirm, is that it is much more costly to try and retrofit, urban infrastructure and equipment, and much less costly to try and plan ahead and get it right from the start. So, to the extent that the bulk of the urban infrastructure that will need to be in place by 2050, still has to be constructed. There's a lot that we can do to improve on the past decade's experiences, but that requires very, very bold policy changes that need to happen now. I have also something on natural resources for Yongtae. Why are some countries succeeding and some struggling? Again, You're very right to say that natural resources in themselves are not necessarily a curse. If you look at a number of countries that are today in the OECD, such as Chile, for instance, it's a case of a country that didn't really succeed thanks to its industry or manufacturing activities. It's what they did, and that many African countries that are endowed with natural resources don't do, is to first diversify their economy across natural resources. What Chile did, for instance, is that it started with copper and then invested the money from copper into pulp, wood, which is also a natural resource, but of a different kind. And then invested again, in wine, and invested again in seafood, for instance, to the extent that they're now a competitor of Scotland for salmon farming, for instance. So all this is diversification first across natural resources sectors, including agriculture. Angola is an agricultural power that in the making, but suffers from being too focused on oil. Natural resources abundance is not a curse, it's dependency, which is a problem. So there are ways of moving around it. The first thing to do is to diversify across natural resources, make the most of it, and then we can generate enough to invest in more value-adding industrial and service-based activities. Just a small bit of an answer to your question.
Right, thank you. Anton, from your side.
Okay, so well, I think it was Robert's question. So I mean, I suppose the point which I need to make up front on this is, and it's been made by Bernard, but I think, so we need both rural development and urban development, but let's be quite frank about this, that rural development is the most expensive way of trying to do urban development. Okay? And that's sometimes how it's construed, that we protect our cities by doing rural development projects. So let's not do that. Let's recognize that people are moving to cities. And then, to the question, so I mean, the neat answer obviously is, well, we need female education. That's probably the most valuable thing you can invest in, both because of the economic benefits and the fertility benefits that come with that. You need infrastructure and services, and you need work, not necessarily job, but work opportunities that give people a sense of identity and a sense of place. The reality is that unless we have a change that I can't foresee in the fiscal and the financing regime, we're not going to get that. And so I think, slum urbanism is likely to be the lived reality of most urban Africans for some time to come. And then I think the way around that, and I guess Henry Bernard touched on this, is so we need new partnerships for service delivery in these communities. And you see the makings of those in some of the off-grid sanitation, off-grid energy stuff. But mostly the local authorities, when they try and deliver services, victimize and sometimes even criminalize these waste pickers and the organic, the informal service delivery systems that have emerged. And I think we need to get beyond that criminalization or that antagonism and have new partnerships for service delivery into informal settlements, into slums, that both provide people with work, some measure of service, and enfranchise them in the local economy. So I think that that's really important. Of course, the longer term challenge, as I've intimated, I think is for the global capital regime. We don't have the fiscal base yet in African cities to provide the degree of services that we require. And so, the $400 trillion question, because that's the sum of the resources available, is how do we get these deep pools of capital in the world to invest in things which are actually financially uncompelling, unattractive, right? They're public goods, low returns, high risk, unfamiliar. Those are four criteria which make any financier run as far and as fast as they can, and yet we have to overcome that inherent difficulty if we're going to address the problem. But that's I guess, a finance issue. So then there was a question. So the green growth theory and practice. So I think you're right. The question is right to point out the discrepancy. There's a difference, right? And I think it's something that I struggle with a bit, is there's a lack of economic growth theory in some of the green growth literature. And we need to all work on that a bit more. Because it's not immediately obvious as to how these green growth initiatives collate to constitute the type of growth which attracts a finance minister at the national level. And I think we need to work on that, and some of our work is trying to focus on that. And you know, the first danger that you need to try and prevent is that the environment is seen as a luxury good. And I think Kooky spoke to this, right? Because this is very often the case, that you grow first and you look after the environment later. Or we don't have the time, and we don't have, and we know that's not going to work. That notion of an environmental Kuznets curve, that's not going to work. So I think it comes back to Kooky's presentation, actually. If we're going to bridge this divide, that you know, economies grow. Well, this is what I was taught anyway. Economies grow because of the marginal productivity of capital. Okay? But I think we need to expand the definition of capital to include both natural capital, social and institutional, possibly, and that speaks to the partnerships points I made earlier. And possibly, although this is more tricky, to expand the definition of productivity. And, you know, so beyond GDP into welfare criteria, and particularly welfare criteria for the most vulnerable, because so we have inclusive growth. There was a third question around natural resources, which I think Henry Bernard answered much better than I can. The interesting comparison, I suppose, on the African continent is Lagos and Luanda. Lagos, which more or less has survived, in spite of its predisposition, has survived the drop in the oil price economically, not unaffected, but there's still good economic activity there. Luanda struggling much more. And certainly one of the key distinctions between the two cities is that Lagos has a recognized and functional local authority looking to marshal resources at the local level, whereas Luanda, much less so. Right? Still very centrally coordinated from the national capital, from national government. And I think that local institutional capacity is one of the ways in which you sidestep the so-called commodity curse. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Anton. So now we have a few other questions I'd like to pose to the panel. We have two from Soni Gitu Ekpe. His first is, how can we develop a more reliable data on natural resources considering the cultural beliefs of Africa on documentation? It's an interesting question. Second question is posed specifically towards to WWF. He says WWF is not currently working in Nigeria, so he's wondering about plans or how you can support the continental-wide cost-benefit analysis of ecosystem services, particularly in the West African region. And the third question, another question from Hyung Tae Kim. He asks, some African countries have not established stable legal systems or land tenure rights yet. Is it feasible to attract investments to build sustainable cities? And how can we tackle this confidence issue? So let me start this time, perhaps start with Henri Bernard.
Sure. Well, on the issue of natural resource exploration, the one thing I would stress is that African natural resources are probably amongst the least well-known in the world. We found out a few years ago when we were looking into the issue that while in natural resource-rich countries in Asia and in OECD countries, on average $65 is spent per square kilometer to explore the availability of natural resources, that amount goes down from $65 to $5 on average in the case of the African continent. So there's first an issue of under-exploration, if you wish, that makes the natural resources in Africa not, if anything, not overexploited yet, but rather underexploited. There was a question on supporting rural development and whether cities are really the main driver for this. Yes, I do believe that cities have a key role to play. I will reemphasize the point. Urban dwellers represent, on average, on the continent about 40% of the population, but they represent 50% of the consumption of food, and they represent 60% of the market, that is, of the money that's available to pay for the crops that come from African rural areas. There's clearly here a huge market, a huge opportunity for agricultural production in Africa. But again, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens only if producers are connected to consumers. And if infrastructure that's available, if the cold chain supply, make it easier to source, say, for supermarkets in Eastern and Southern Africa from local and regional markets than it is to source from China or India or Brazil or the US or Europe. So I guess a major challenge ahead of African policymakers is to make sure that the African producers in rural areas are connected to African consumers in urban areas, because that is a condition under which cities will play their role in driving transformation in rural areas as well.
Thank you. Anton?
So I'll start with the cost-benefit question, if I understood it correctly. So, look, I think it's important to do this work, but as someone who occasionally gets requested to do the work, my own impression is that certainly on the natural capital, cost-benefit is quite a blunt instrument. I think I alluded to this earlier, or maybe necessary but insufficient again, and for a number of reasons. So I think if you do this stuff, you need to be very specific about cost to who and benefit for who. Yeah, because there isn't a sort of aggregate cost benefit that you can apply to Africa's natural resources. Yeah, and that's precisely the issue, and that's precisely why these cost benefit kind of compacts and numbers don't gain traction at the local level. And then, of course, let's recognize that the benefits of biodiversity, or it's a subjective thing. And it's a bit of a cliche, but if you don't know how you're going to feed your child tonight, you're not worried about the primate diversity in a local forest. And so we need to find ways of linking what we construe as costs and benefits to what people on the ground, what really matters for them. And that's very difficult to do. And certainly, it necessitates that we treat these big aggregates with some caution, I think. Certainly as policy instruments. Maybe again necessary, but insufficient, because of the subjectivity and because of the difference of who are we reporting on behalf. And it takes me back to my point, is that I think I'm more comfortable, and I've come around to this point quite recently. I'm more comfortable with a global effort that tries to price carbon or re-rate natural capital, and so that it delivers benefits to people on the ground, and particularly poor people on the ground. By conferring some ownership or some royalty to them in the process. And I think that's also the most robust stewardship model, incidentally, is that when you enfranchise local people. So that's on that. On land tenure, well, obviously, it's different. And as I alluded to, I think one of the challenges is how do we finance public goods and communal tenure, and how do we negotiate with traditional authorities around urban spatial forms, around land for food production, land for housing. These are very emotive and tricky negotiations with sometimes very different value systems underpinning them that aren't always recognized. And again, I think that particular example on negotiations around land with traditional authorities is one of the acute examples of something that can only really be done effectively at the local level. It's very difficult to get the nuance and the detail of a land negotiation with a traditional authority right from national government. And again, this underpins the point of the need for local governance capacity, which in most instances does not yet exist to a satisfactory level. There was a point around data on natural resources. I'm not sure of the answer to that, to be honest. I guess the GIS software helps a little bit, that Henry Bernard referred to earlier, but I would want to ground truth that with the people who walk these hills every day and who understand the urban fabric every day, what they see and what they experience, because I think that would be very important. But I think the existing technology is unlocking new resources all the time. How we marshal those and steward those is very important. So gas is the obvious example, right? So there are new gas finds on the African continent almost weekly, it would seem. what do we do with that? You know, we subject it to the Leave It in the Ground campaign. Do we see it as a stepping stone feedstock to a low carbon development, or you know, how we do that? I think is very important. But new resources are going to be found, and they are being found already.
Thank you. Yes, definitely challenging. Kooky, your reflections on this series of questions?
Okay, so maybe let me start with the question around the data and WWF. First of all, we do work in West Africa in a number of countries, and in Nigeria we have a partner organization, the Nigerian Conservation Organization. But more importantly, I think we've always worked with partners, and I don't necessarily think that WWF has to be in each country for us to actually collect the right sort of information in Africa. We partner with many organizations, both international and local. So Wetland International, IUCN, the Ramsar Convention, and others. We are working with them to actually look at, for instance, what is the value of economic value of wetlands to cities. So Ramsar has passed a resolution to actually accredit cities sustainable use of their wetlands. This is in process, and at some point in the coming 1.5 years it should be ratified. So it'll be interesting to see which cities are going to volunteer for that. This brings me to the point around the valuation and understanding the cost-benefit analysis, making a cost-benefit analysis for ecosystem services at the continent level. The reason I say this is that what you don't value, if you want to manage what you have, you need to be able to understand what the value is and what the importance it is for the public good, be it economic development or poverty reduction and so on. And my belief is that actually the poor and the people in the rural areas or urban areas are the ones who mostly also depend on natural resources to actually get their services. And therefore, it's quite important that we understand how the value of this is, or what that it means if it is actually lost or degraded, and they don't have the income actually to compensate. Therefore, I think it's important for us to be able to make sure that we understand what the costs are and what the benefits are. The benefit don't necessarily mean just the pricing of it, and therefore, the person who can afford the highest price is able to have it. It's more about being able to actually include it in the economic value and how we generate our income. So actually, again, as Anton said, expanding what we mean by wealth, GDP, and going beyond that, but also looking at what expanding the capital to include the natural capital is contribution to the economy, and etc. And I do actually, I'm glad you mentioned the role of institutions and capacity building. Actually, that really goes back to, again, to the land tenure and how you manage these processes in place. Because as my colleague here sitting next to me highlighted to me, actually, what also happens is that city authorities often also ignore national laws to, for instance, not build on wetlands, or not to make sure that you include ecosystem services, etc. They basically ignore it as well. So it goes the other way around. If maybe mega cities or big cities become way too powerful and not necessarily, adhere to the national laws. I don't know if I'm missing any point. I guess on the land tenure, this is my personal view, is to say that this is very different in different parts of Africa, and very much different even within countries. And there's a huge history and sensitivities that goes with it. The point is that if you start to plan and design, you already come across these issues, and therefore you start also to look at how you're going to solve these problems, as opposed to having some policy intervention without really looking at how is it going to land on the ground, what's going to mean actually when it's being implemented, and not going kind of this bottom up and top bottom kind of approach. So you are actually having a participatory approach from the people on the ground to the decision makers at the national level. So that is important. I just want to come back on the data bit. I think Henry mentioned as well earlier is that it is absolutely important for us to be able to say, I mean, when we were looking for some data to map out using GIS mapping, for instance, we couldn't find anything even on climate change impact or carbon emission or anything like that at the city level, mega cities, big cities. If some of this data is available, maybe it was just for research projects that somebody has done, or if there are some institutions which have done this work, it's not publicly available. So if this is an important thing for us to do to help us making the right sort of public policies, then there needs to be at the Africa level or at least sub-regional level some sort of investment in institutionalizing this kind of relevant information at the Africa level, so actually people can make better decisions. I mean, this happens at the European Union. I mean, this may be one example of looking at it where you have a statistics office where it links with the national offices and the cities, etc. I mean, there are incredibly interesting and great opportunities and platforms for cities to collect this information, but I feel at the moment it's very much disjointed. It's not in a way where it's actually you could compare and collect the data. And so I think there's a need to, talking about the institutions, what sort of institutional arrangement is required for cities and sub-regional entities to actually work together with the national authorities or city countries to collect the right sort of information. So I don't know where that means, but I think this is an issue that hopefully could potentially be addressed at Habitat 3 because it is quite important for investors as well to be able to actually do their own analysis.
Thanks, Kooky. And thanks also for mentioning Habitat 3. We're actually quickly running out of time, or a little bit over time, so I'm just hoping that the panel will indulge one last question we received from a participant, which is from Rosa Pamuye, and she asks, in the face of decreasing agricultural productivity in some African countries, do you think urbanization is actually supporting rural development? I think, and maybe you could even expand that to development more generally. I think it's an interesting question, but I'd also like to use this as an opportunity for the panel to make any final comments they would like to during this webinar, and particularly building on Kooky's comment and looking towards Habitat 3. Do you see? Can you recommend a key policy message that you would like seeing taken to Habitat 3 from the work of this report or other work you're currently engaged in? And what would you like to see the governments highlighting and focusing on there? So let me this time first turn to Anton.
Gosh, so I mean, it's hard to counter the evidence, particularly there's the evidence around or struggling rural economies in the face of urbanization. But I think the point that the report makes very well, and I think it backs us up both conceptually and with some data, is that it need not be that way, and that it's the linkages and the virtuous cycles, which include the movement of people as well as food and other natural resources between rural economies and urban economies, which I think offers the greatest hope. And creating those linkages is important. Obviously, where the transport infrastructure and other prerequisites for that virtuous cycle aren't in place, you can get a trade-off, but it need not be that way. And I think that's an important advance in the discourse from where we've been in the past, which is either that cities, rural development is at the cost of cities, or vice versa. And I think we need to get beyond that polarized standoff, because ultimately it's around the national development. And as the demographics show, both rural and urban populations are growing fast. With regards to Habitat 3, well, I mean, I guess my main prescript would be that they read the African Economic Outlook. Not really, but I think one of the things a term that's emerged in the lead up to Habitat 3, which I think needs a lot more scrutiny and a lot more work, is this multi-level governance. It's very important, but it rolls off the tongue. And exactly what's involved and exactly how we confront the tensions within that, and what are the different institutional hybrids that are going to be appropriate in different contexts when we talk about multi-level governance. I think that's something which I hope is raised at Habitat 3 and then leads to strand of work, because I think it's crucial, particularly in the African continent where we don't have robust local governments, and we certainly don't have fiscally empowered local governments to manage these tricky trade-offs and support development. So multi-level governance is something that we'll be watching quite closely. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Anton. Kooky, your final words.
Okay, so I would concur with Anton as well. I think the issue around the governance and how do we actually finance public policy? What are the financing mechanisms that we could help shape with financial institutions, as we know that more and more infrastructure is going to be invested, financed by the private sector, and what does this mean for Africa when you don't have the institutional capacity or the scale and capability of, let's say, other big cities in Africa? How do we make sure that this happens? As we know, the public finances are now not really sufficient to meet the demand for the urban infrastructure, or the infrastructure to connect cities as well. So I think that's an important agenda to address, and to also look at other options, not just kind of this discourse has been already ongoing about rural development versus cities and so on. So to look at how do we depoliticize it and really look at that and look at solutions. I guess my recommendation I will point out is to look at opportunities. I mean, despite of all the challenges that we've seen, there are also opportunities in terms of low footprint of African cities, ecological footprint. I mean, we have mobile banking in Africa, which has been successful and expanding. So how can we then, capitalize on that sort of energy and commitment to see what can we do with the renewables and the technology that's out there to be able actually to have cities, or to build cities, maybe even to start with the secondary cities, to say, with the cities that are going to be, developing and expanding going forward, what can we do that's going to be low carbon and sustainable in the long term? And with that, I would like to make the point that we need to make sure that we include nature as part of as a driver for economic development, and that actually mismanaging it, be it being dependent on it and depleting it, is actually going to be bad for the economy, bad for people, and for poverty reduction. So I think recognizing that is crucial, and looking at how urbanization in cities could champion a different way of living for Africa today. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, excellent, thank you. Thank you, Kooky. So, Henri Bernard, you have the final word in today's discussion.
A great honor. In terms of what I hope to hear in Quito from UN Habitat, I just want to reinforce the point that Anton just made on multi-level governance, to say that I really hope that we will move away from a debate that this is sometimes a bit stale, and it seems to hinge around the understanding that it's either the central level government or the local level that has the power and that has the resources. Obviously, it works when the two work together. And you need to think more in terms of the contractual nature of the relationship between these two levels of governance, central and municipal, rather than either or. That's not how it works. So I really hope that whatever comes out of Quito will be informed by this more mature take on what decentralization entails. And then finally, we're not going to solve all the problems in that week in Quito in October. What counts is what's going to happen for the next 20 years. And what I really hope is that in terms of concrete deliverables, we'll come out with new spaces, new tools, new platforms for the different actors, particularly of the financing of African cities, can get together, divide labor, and exchange on what works and what doesn't, take examples from urbanization experiences in Asia and Latin America and other countries to try and move the agenda forward. Because the key question of who's going to finance African cities, I think, is really a very important one. And I hope that after Quito, we will have very efficient mechanisms for finding innovative answers to that question. We certainly want at the OECD Development Center to be part of those efforts. And let me finish by thanking the Green Growth Knowledge Platform. You're doing an excellent job, and Benjamin in particular, and all the team that's been organizing the webinar. It's been a real pleasure, so congratulations.
Thank you, Henri Bernard. So unfortunately, we've reached the end of the time available. It's been a fascinating discussion. But on behalf of the GGKP, I would just like to thank all the participants in today's webinar for joining us. We encourage the participants to explore the African Economic Outlook 2016, and we also want to sincerely thank once again our speakers and discussants. I think it's been really an excellent exchange. Thank you, Henri Bernard, thank you, Kooky, thank you, Anton, for providing your time and thoughts. And particularly, we hope the participants have gained some new insights and appreciation of the risks, but as Kooky mentioned, also the unique opportunities posed by the African urbanization trends. With that, we will draw this webinar to a close, and thank you once again for your participation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you. Bye-bye.